The wind had been peeling at the paint on my porch for 3 winters, and I hadn't done a thing about it. Some chores a man avoids because he's lazy, some because he's tired, and some because they make a noise he doesn't want to hear. Scraping old paint is like turning pages you weren't brave enough to read the first time. I had a can of white in the shed, brushes in a coffee can bristling like a hedgehog, and all afternoon to climb the ladder and get on with it. Instead, I sat on the top step with a mug that smelled of last night's coffee burned twice and watched the windmill count the minutes in clicks. That was the hour he came, small, silent, holding the world in his eyes like he didn't trust his hands with it. If he had knocked, I might have missed it. If he had called out, the canyon would have swallowed him whole. He stepped from behind the cedar windbreak like a rabbit deciding a hawk had already made up its mind. He was thin the way a pencil is thin, a straight fact with no fat on the truth. 8, maybe 9, haircut square across the brow and braided to 2 lines that fell to his collar. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and someone had mended it with a stitch that was more prayer than technique. His lips were cracked white. Dust lay in the corners of his eyes like secrets. He looked at the windmill, at me, and then at the water barrel beside the steps. He didn't speak. He lifted a hand, palm cupped, then let it fall. It was the ask you make when language is a door you don't expect to be invited through. I stood, set the mug on the rail, and tried to keep my own movement slow enough not to scare the morning. "Water," I said, the way you say it when you point to the dipper and make a space wider than words. He took the tin, drank like a cautious animal, steady, no boast, no gulp, and handed it back with a nod that had all the country in it. He had a strip of beaded leather at his wrist, small triangles in earth colors, a sky-blue bead running through like a creek in August. I had seen beadwork like it at a trading post one winter, admired the patience it took to make a story hold still. He wore moccasins, soles scuffed down to confession. Long walk, I thought, long enough to make a child forget his fear of gates and ghosts and men. "Come inside," I said, and then realized how a door can look to someone who has learned that doorways are where trouble keeps its paperwork. I went first. He waited at the threshold, watched my back, then slid in sideways, inch by inch, until his shoulder cleared and his eyes found the stove. The house had been too quiet for 3 years. A man lives in it long enough, and the walls learn his habits and sigh at the same time he does. Since my wife Clara left me for the Rosemary Hill on the west side of the house, all the noises had been mine. The boots by the door, the cup set down, the chair pulled out. Hearing another breath under my roof was like catching the smell of rain before you see the cloud. On the top of the stove, a pot held the thing I made when the day gave me no reason to make better. Beans, a fist of dried beef, onion, a chili that makes its case without turning courtroom into theater. I ladled a bowl and set it on the table. He hung back. It took me a breath to remember the rule. A child taught to count threats waits to see you eat before he eats. I spooned a mouthful, blew across it, swallowed, and put the spoon's handle toward him. He came forward then, quick but not greedy, set his mouth to the wood and took that warm taste into himself like a man takes confession. We didn't talk, because words aren't always the first tool. He ate in measures, 2 spoons, pause, 2 spoons, glance, 1 spoon, a sound I would call gratitude, if I dared call anything by a name that far above my pay. I tore a heel of bread and set it on the table. He looked at the window, the door, the corners, the way a boy looks for a trap that is only habit. Then he took the bread in both hands and tucked it inside his shirt. "Name?" I asked, touching my chest. "Eli." "Idi." He touched his own chest, said something with 2 syllables that lifted at the end, then repeated it slower, giving me a chance to stand up straight and not embarrass both of us. The last sound clicked off his teeth like a bead struck with a fingernail. I tried the first half of it, watched his eyes, added the second. He gave me a half nod that could mean close enough for now, or we'll fix it later. I had not been given the job of naming him. That was a relief. Rain tried the roof and gave up. The wind went around the house and found the places the chinking had forgotten. I set another log on the fire and showed him the rifle pegs above the stove. Rifle set up there with the breech open. I did that as much for me as for him. A man needs a visible promise in a world that trades in invisible threat. He did not ask to sleep. He balanced on the edge of the chair until his bones told him the chair would hold. He watched the stove the way a dog watches a door. I took a quilt from the cedar chest and laid it near the hearth. He slid from the chair to the quilt like a man lowering a flag in the half-light. Hands careful, breath measured, the ritual of surrender practiced only in safe places. In 5 minutes he was still awake, in 10, asleep. In 12, the worry left his face the way a banked fire leaves fewer shadows. I lay back on my bedstead and stared at the ceiling boards that Clara had sanded smooth one summer evening. Her palm prints were there in my memory. My mouth said her name. You would think after 3 years a man's chest would not tighten at the shape his house takes without the shape of the person who made the house into a home. You would be wrong. Sometime near midnight, he woke with a breath that wanted to be a cry, but had been told not to go too loud. He sat up, eyes open, listening, then lay back down. Coyotes were tuning themselves out near the rim. A pack always argues when weather changes. He lifted the bread through his shirt, pressed it to his heart, and I understood a kind of liturgy I had not been raised to attend. At first light, the wind came from the south, warm with the promise that storms had run out of patience in other counties. I went out to the porch to look at the sky and taste the day. If you've lived alone long enough, you know the taste of a day before the day knows what to make of you. I heard it before I saw it, a low, steady thrum, the kind that vibrates the boards under your feet before your brain earns the right to a name. Hooves, many, not running but moving in measure. The windmill clicked once, twice like a clock clearing its throat before a proclamation. Dust rose on the far edge of my south pasture, not in plumes, in a sheet, then broke into threads, then into lines, then into horses, then into people. The boy had already stood in the doorway, not behind me, not ahead, beside, half a pace back the way a person does who has been taught that gratitude is not the same as claim. His eyes narrowed and softened at the same time, if such a thing is possible. He touched his wrist where the beadwork lived, and then his chest, then the space between us. If he had had a better teacher, he might have spoken a whole sentence. He had me, so we stood in the grammar of our bodies and let the country translate. From the east, riders came, men and women and 2 elders lashed to drag poles behind steady ponies. Not a charge, a settlement with the horizon. When they reached the fence line, they spread like water does around a stone and made a wide ring. Careful, breathing, not tight enough to choke, not loose enough to mean nothing. A man rode forward with a lance upright, a strip of white cloth tied beneath its point. The cloth flicked once in the slow wind, a small flag for a large language I did not speak. Behind me from the north, another dust rose. The thin, impatient kind that iron rims make when the drivers have a story they want to tell before breakfast. I didn't turn. I knew who they were. I knew what they believed about a child at my door. I knew what I had done, and I knew what I would do now. Whatever else I had failed to keep in order, the house was in agreement with me on this. A child had come hungry. A spoon had crossed the space between us. A night had passed without fear. The world could take its complaint to a higher court. The man with the lance waited, then said something without leaning on it. The boy took a step and didn't finish it. He looked at me, then at the lance, then at the ring. He pressed the bread through his shirt like a man fixing a photograph into a frame. The riders beyond the fence didn't shift their weight. There was no weapon pointed, no voice raised, only presence. The soft kind that says we came because love told us there's a math here that needs checking. I lifted my hands. We'll do this right, I said to the morning, because the morning was the only witness I could trust to keep a record without prejudice. And then I took the wooden spoon from the table, slid it into my belt like a badge, and stepped off the porch into the day that was waiting to see if I meant what I had already done. A man with a lance upright means one thing in 100 miles of country, and another entirely in the gossip of a saloon. The white cloth tied below the point said peace in a dialect I did not speak, but could hear in my ribs. I walked out into the open with my hat off because my father taught me that a hat on your head, while you ask mercy, makes the ask smaller than it needs to be. The boy walked with me, one step behind, then even, then a half step ahead, his body's map still deciding how to draw lines between safety, loyalty, and the simple gravity of blood. The man with the lance stopped 10 strides away, a distance a bullet disrespects, but a man honors. He spoke my name the way a careful carpenter moves a borrowed plane. I didn't know I told him my name. Then again, there are ways a man tells his name without words. The way he holds a spoon, the way he keeps his rifle with its breech open, the way he does not move the child in front of him like a token. He said the boy's name, 2 names really. The everyday one that had a laugh at the edge of it, and the cradle one. The one you only use when the fire is low and you are asking the day to be kinder. The boy's chest lifted and fell like the first breath after a deep dive. He made a sound I will not try to spell. That was when the iron rims threw their story into the yard. From the north came a string of wagons and riders, the sheriff's nephew, Keating's boys, 2 men who make a living finding fences to test, and the traveling blacksmith whose opinions are louder than his work. They saw the ring and not the room inside it. They saw the lance and not the cloth. They saw me and wanted me on their side because nothing spoils a man's day like losing the company of someone who makes him feel right about his wrongs. "You got yourself a parley here, Eli?" the nephew shouted, as if loudness could make a law. "I have a child going home," I said, and my voice didn't carry so much as rest where it needed to. The sheriff's nephew lifted his rifle to the place where practice lives, but cowardice does not, as if to see how it felt. He liked the feel. That was clear from the way his shoulders set. The man with the lance did not move. The ring around us rippled once, a low communication in horses' legs and people's breath, the way a pond ripples when the wind tries on a new suit. "Lower that gun," I said, and did not look at the boy because this was not his responsibility. "If it goes off, your grandchildren will hear about you, and not from you." The blacksmith's horse tossed his head at a fly. The eldest Keating boy spat and missed the mark because his mouth had grown too fast for his practice. Somewhere to the east, the windmill clicked once, a metronome with a kind heart. "Eli," the blacksmith said, not unkindly, "you'll have a barn to burn if you don't tell these folks this isn't what it looks like." "I won't lie to save lumber," I said. "It looks like a family finding someone they lost. It looks like me doing the thing you say in church you admire and are secretly glad you haven't had to do. It looks like a white cloth doing better work than your gun could do on its best day." Behind me, the screen door on my porch creaked. I didn't turn, but I knew the sound. Mabel Finch's step, slow and sure, a kettle lifted in one hand as if coffee could arbitrate. "If any of you have a complaint," she said, her voice level as pond water and twice as reflective, "you can put it into a cup and I'll pour it out for you to admire. Otherwise, lower your voices and let a morning be what it's trying to be. There are a dozen ways to end a fight and 100 to start one. Most endings begin with the first fool learning to close his mouth. The nephew lowered his rifle not out of understanding, but because his arms were tired and a woman had called him out in public. The man with the lance nudged his horse forward the last of the 10 paces, stopped within reach, and drew from his belt a spoon, not unlike the one at my side, polished, neck beaded, the wood dark with oil and age. He held it out in his palm. Not a demand, not payment, a bridge. I took mine and laid it across his, and he took mine, the way a man takes the hand of someone who just admitted out loud he was wrong once and is trying very hard not to be again. He tied the spoon with my simple beadwork to the strap at his shoulder. He tied his to the loop at my belt. The wind moved just then, and the white cloth lifted once, and I felt the world decide against blood. The ring loosened. The woman I would come to know as a grandmother rode forward, her hair braided with grey that shone like a winter river, her face lined the way a field is lined after careful ploughing. She dismounted slow, bent her knees before her back, and reached for the boy with hands that knew the heft of him from the day his bones were still busy choosing how to lengthen. She did not scoop him up. She set her palms to his cheeks like a person memorizing a blessing. "He ate under my roof," I said, because men in my county like facts, and this was mine. She touched her cheek, then the boy's chest, then set her hand flat on the earth and lifted it, up, across, toward me. Gratitude, not debt. Relief, not bargain. She spoke my name and turned it the way a person turns a new tool to see how it works. I heard my father in my chest again, and I said the only thing that had any chance of being the right thing. "You're welcome." Indeed, we stood like that long enough for the iron rims to lose interest and the gossip to find other work. Then the ring turned and flowed back down my lane, the way water leaves a field it has watered. The boy looked back once, the bread still to his chest. He lifted the cloth, pressed it once, as if telling it to remember, and faced forward into his life. The man with the lance touched 2 fingers to his temple and let them fall in my direction. Not a salute, exactly. More like an admission that the morning had been a group project. I thought that was that. I am a fool in some seasons. I should have remembered something my wife used to say when she worked a quilt. What you do with your hands today, the world will answer later with its own hands. I had fed a child, and the household of that child had answered with a spoon and a circle instead of a wound. I had meant to sleep that night like a man who had found a scrap of his better self under the bed and put it back in his pocket. I blew out the lamp and let the house breathe, and I forgot that gratitude in some languages is a verb. Before dawn, when this part of the world belongs to milkers and liars, I woke to a sound I've never heard before and have heard every morning since, if I listen right. The sound of work arriving as a gift. Hooves, yes, but softer, and the rasp and slide of wood on wood, and the creak of leather under a load that fits it, and low voices that keep animals from thinking they are the train. I pulled my boots on without a lamp. I stepped into the yard to invest in whatever the day was selling. From down the lane they came, not a ring this time. A line, ponies pulling drag poles stacked with mesquite and cedar cut square, grass bales slung in pairs, sacks of cornmeal, bundles of smoked meat wrapped in tanned hide, clay jars stopped with cloth, 2 rolled-up blankets tied with strips of buckskin, a bale hook with a fresh handle, 3 tools whose names I would learn by using them. Men and women, boys old enough to stand up to the weight of a gift, girls who could carry as if they'd been practicing all their lives for lifting someone else's worry. They did not call out. They did not wait for permission the way shame does. They went directly to my barn, the old chestnut thing that had a roof like a drunk's hat and a loft that no longer trusted its own ladder, and they put their gifts inside, not tossed, stacked, tied, stored. Wood climbed along the wall in a neat crib that would outlast the winter. Hay rose in a square that would keep my herd alive when wind came with opinions. The smoked meat went high under the rafters. The jars sat in a row on my rough shelf and made it look like a kitchen had leaned out into the yard to say hello. I stood with my mouth open like a man who had finally heard his name pronounced correctly. Mabel appeared at my elbow with a shawl and a look on her face like an answer in church. "Well," she said softly, "if you ever doubted reciprocity was a muscle, there's your proof it lifts more than a man's pride." The grandmother came to the barn door and looked into my face, the way a person looks at a fence they plan to mend for you, without telling you you built it wrong. She touched the frame of the door, pushed 1 board into place, and handed me a leather bag. Inside was a small pouch of seeds, beans as black as midnight, corn kernels the color of old honey. She put her hand to her heart, then flat to her belly, then tapped the bag. Food, yes, but also the means to make food. Down, payment, and lesson. "They're filling your barn, Eli," Mabel said, "and it seems to me they're also refitting your vocabulary." The tribe stayed until the barn could tell the sun, with a straight face, that it had never been so ready for a season. One man climbed to the roof and drove pegs where I had promised myself nails would go next week. 2 boys with knife blades as dull as spoons trimmed the frays on my old rope halters and made them new, because love is a kind of sharpening. A woman set a broom she had brought in the corner and swept once as if to whisper, "Begin here." I kept saying thank you in 100 small languages, my hat off, my hands open, my eyes doing what they could with water that comes when a man admits the world has done better by him than he ever asked of it. The grandmother pressed my spoon's beadwork under her thumb, testing its knot, then patted my chest twice, over the place where a man keeps his complicated heart. By full dawn, the yard was quiet. The line that had arrived had left. My barn had become a ledger I had not asked to be written into, the bales and wood and jars spelling out a sentence that would take the winter to read. On the last drag pole, tied so it would not fall, hung a rectangle of beadwork on a strip of leather. Triangles, small and precise, in earth colors, and running through them a line of blue, the exact shade of the creek that runs in my south pasture when it remembers how. A boy had made it. I could see the steadiness and unevenness both. The grandmother took it down, looped it around my wrist, and tied it with a gesture that had the weight of law without the noise of it. When quiet comes after such a morning, a man hears the house sit different on its stones. I stood in my doorway and looked at the barn. I had believed myself a lonely rancher. I still was, in many honest ways. But loneliness is a thing that can become a choice or a habit if you let it, and habits can be unlearned by acts too simple to brag about. I went inside and brewed coffee that didn't taste like it had been punished. I poured a cup for Mabel and set one aside, out of old habit, for Clara. I told the empty chair what had happened, and if you think that foolish, you have not been alone long enough. The sheriff's nephew rode by late morning, as people do when they hope something they feared has turned into something they can understand. He stopped, pulled his hat and scratched the back of his head, as if looking for the word his mother used to use when she had to apologize without losing footing. "Eli," he said, "there's hay in your barn." "There is," I said. "And wood." "Yes, and jars, and meat, and a broom," I said, "because some gifts deserve witnesses." He swallowed. "You paying taxes on all that?" "Soon as I figure out how to write it down so the county clerk doesn't mistake gratitude for inventory." Deke, he tugged his brim and rode on. 2 miles later I imagined him telling his uncle at the stove that a white cloth had out-negotiated a gun, and his old neighbor had accepted being helped without losing his shape. That's a hard story for some men to form their mouths around. It was the only one I had. That night the wind changed. Snow came in behind it like a rumor that decided to be a fact. I slept with the sound of hay settling in its crib, and wood talking to itself in the stack and jars of beans adjusting to their shelf. I had not asked the world to make me a better man. The world had asked me, and I had said yes once with a spoon. The dawn had answered with a barn. The first snow lays down a hush that teaches a man how loud he has been. On the second day after the dawn of the barn, the hush arrived. The wind that had fussed and argued for 3 days went east to bother some other county. Over the pasture a grey lid settled gently, and the flakes began, 1,000 little treaties coming down at once. I stoked the stove, hung a kettle from the arm the way Clara had taught me, and stepped into the yard with a bucket and the kind of resolve a warm barn demands. I opened the big doors, and the smell came out. The hay, sweet and grassy, the mesquite stack resin bright, the smoke in the meat like a long sentence finishing itself. My herd moved in slow and skeptical, then fast and grateful. The first flake that landed on the lead cow's nose was an opinion. The second was a rule. The third was surrender. She put her head down and made of herself a plough through the white. I spread hay with a fork someone else had brought to the place where a man usually only puts his own tools. That fork sat right in my hands, as if grief had been telling me for years that it would work with me if I would only get up in the morning and try. The cattle ate with that steady sound you can hear in your ribs, the one that says, "Not all solvable weights are yours." When I came back to the house, my wrist warmed under the beadwork. I touched the triangles with my thumb. The thing about a gift that fits is that you forget it is on your skin until you need to remember why your chores are going better than they used to. Weeks do what they do, stack themselves in small, believable piles. I fed cattle in a barn that thanked me for feeding cattle. I cut lengths of the mesquite the tribe had brought and split them, and learned the grain of that wood the way a man learns the grain of his own stubbornness, by failure, then practice, then a joy he doesn't explain to anyone who doesn't already know. At night, I cooked beans with the black ones from the pouch, and they tasted different, not because they were magical, but because someone had put them in my hand with a look that made me straighten my back before I took them. I saw the tribe now and then in that winter, 2 hunters following a line I could not see, a woman with a bundle of willow on her back moving across the ridge, 1 notch slower than the wind. Once, at dusk, the boy came with 2 men, older than him but younger than his uncles, and they stood at my fence and did not cross it. The boy had a blanket folded like a lesson. I brought my hat and my spoon and stood in the yard, where the snow that had fallen earlier had hardened its opinion and turned the ground into a table. He lifted the blanket and showed me its edge, where the stitching had learned how to be steady. He turned it once so I could admire the pattern. He did not hand it to me. He handed me the sight of it. That was fair. I had no place for a blanket that had not yet made a promise to someone else. We spoke the language we had. Palms open, eyebrows telling truth the mouth would fumble. The boy's name said right when he had earned me the right to practice it. Before he left, he held up 2 fingers at shoulder height, his palm inward, a small signal that said, twice. Twice we had done right by each other, and he meant to keep count. In late January, when the sun remembered we existed, I rode into town, my list in my pocket, as men do when they need more nails and conversation. At Finch's, a group of men had gathered to admire their grievances. Boone Keating was there, of course he was, working the room like a man who thinks charisma is a license. He spun a yarn about Eli's new friends that had the lies a good story uses to make a bad point. He mentioned my barn in a tone that suggested a treason men needed to be braver about naming. Mabel had a way of ending careers without starting fights. She slid him a cup of coffee, then set a plate in front of me that had a biscuit on it big enough to forgive a man's week. "Boone," she said, "when your heifer got herself into the drawer 2 winters ago, who came to help you pull her out?" Boone stalled, and then found the middle distance an attractive friend. "Eli and Elmore," he muttered. "And when Elmore was down last spring, who closed his fence for him?" "Eli," Boone said, lower. "Then you know the currency we keep in this county," she said. "Stop trying to mint your own, the kind that buys you applause and leaves you poor." Even Boone knows when he's outmaneuvered by someone's mother in the body of a storekeeper. He went quiet, and the conversation turned to weather, the one subject that doesn't take sides except against us. On the way home, I met Trudy Black on the trail. She rode with her hat tied down, a scarf over her mouth because the wind had chosen violence. She fell in beside me without asking and handed me a wrapped bundle. Inside, a set of leather hobbles with stitching so precise it could keep a secret, a small sack of something that looked like tea but smelled like forgiveness, a scrap of paper where she, messy as her talent, had put a list in both our languages of what to do when the new calves come and the weather fails them. Rendered tallow rubbed on ears, fire built tight, no water too fast, no pride too high. "The grandmothers wanted you to have the leaves," she said. "Do not be arrogant and think you won't need them." "I do not think that," I said. "I think I have a habit of pretending I am tougher than wind." Toughness is a coin that buys you morning chores, she said. It doesn't get you through storms. Friends do that. Come March, my fences began confessing their age. Winter does that. Pulls nails, loosens staples, finds the one post corner that had a secret residence in rot. I loaded staples and handed myself a schedule I would not meet because the world had other appointments for me. The tribe came to the fence line 2 days into the work. A man I'd seen at the spoon morning nodded at me, swung down from his pony, and reached for my post-hole digger like a person claiming his part of a job you both owned. We worked in a rhythm without discussion. He set posts, I drove staples. A girl, no older than 10, carried wire clips because she had decided that being useful made you taller and she had aims. Halfway down the fence, the sheriff's nephew appeared, hat set for a fight his mouth wasn't ready to have. "Eli," he said, "you going to get license for that help?" "If the county wants to license mending what winter broke," I said, "I'll stand in line with a pocket full of apologies." I said it softly, because soft is the only volume that survives a spring wind. He looked at the girl carrying clips and then at the man setting posts and back at me. He put his hat back where logic belongs, tipped it, and rode on. The county had found a rule that said yes where no had been earning interest. In April, calving started with the opinion it always brings. What if we all came at once to make sure you remember humility? The first night I pulled a britch calf in a cold rain while the ground tried to swallow me and the cow tried to teach me about limitations. My hands cramped, my jaw cramped from the way a man clenches it when he's trying to make a life come through a doorway that is not convinced. The calf slid out at last. A wet complaint turned into a miracle, and I rubbed it hard with burlap and cussed the weather for old time's sake. At the fence line, in the dark, a shape waited. 2 shapes, then 3. The grandmother stepped forward with the sack of leaves Trudy had given me, pinched a bit into a pan, poured boiling water from a kettle I had not seen her carry, and bent the steam to the calf's face with her hands the way a midwife turns a groan into a song. We did that work together for a week. 2 calves, hers by skills, 2 mine by stubborn, 1, twins, ours by improvisation, and a long night. I learned to listen better, to say now and wait, in a language that made the cattle pay attention, to stop thinking my pride was the only thing keeping my ribs in order. Each morning, after a successful save, I would find by my door a small bundle tied with buckskin, a braid of sweetgrass, a bit of ochre, a handful of dried berries. I left by their trail a jar of coffee beans, ground coarse, a small sack of flour, a length of soft rope. A county can be stitched. On a Sunday that had the nerve to be warm like Sunday ought, I rode to the ridge above the south pasture and watched the tribe moving along the draw in that way that makes the land look like it is doing the traveling. The boy broke from the line and came up the slope on a pony whose patience was a sermon, his beadwork flashing once where the sun found it. He slid down, led his pony the last few yards, and stood. He reached into his shirt the way he had that first morning, but this time he drew out not bread but a small wooden figure, a horse carved from a scrap of mesquite, smooth under the belly where a boy's thumb had taught it a lesson. He held it out without saying a word. I took it like a man takes a last letter. I weighed it in my palm. It was a good horse, ears right, legs sure. He pointed with 2 fingers at me, then at the horse, then at the barn down the slope. He opened his palm and closed it, twice, give and receive, twice and twice again. That was the rule now. Not a ledger, a rhythm. I did the only thing I could think to do that had the weight of ceremony without borrowing someone else's. I took off my hat, set it on the grass, lifted him onto the pony as if he were already a man and his pony already a war horse, and walked 2 steps at the pony's head while he sat tall and let the world see what a child looks like when a winter has fed him right. At the fence line he raised his chin once, a small salute, and rejoined the line. The spring went on like springs do, mud where you don't want it, green where you do, a sky that cannot decide if it loves you or is simply tolerating your face. In town, the sheriff's nephew married a girl who laughed like a fence gate in summer, easy and welcoming. Boone Keating began to show up late to his own resentments. Mabel's biscuits got larger, if that is possible. At the trading post, I bought new brushes for the paint I had let peel for 3 winters. I climbed the ladder one bright afternoon and scraped. The old paint came away with a sound, like memory making peace with me. When I finished the north wall and stepped down, the grandmother stood by my porch rail. The beadwork on her cuff caught the new white and made a sun of it. She did not clap or nod or make a joke. She set her hand on the new paint, let her palm sit there a moment, then held it to her heart. She smiled, like a person who knows a fence line is going to hold this year because someone finally set the posts deep and did not argue with the soil about whose job it was to keep what in and what out. We took coffee. She showed me how to tie a different knot, one that holds when a cow insists on pretending she doesn't understand the idea of property. I gave her a tin of sugar because sugar is a shortcut to joy, and not every joy needs scenic routes. We said each other's names better than we had before. Summer arrived with a wind that had grace and better manners. In the hottest part of June, a grass fire started where men think they put out their cigarettes by wishing it so. It ran toward town, like a debt collector. I saddled in a hurry, met the line where the wind met men, and saw, moving into the smoke with method, the same people who had filled my barn. They beat fire with green brush, cut a new line where the old one failed, moved with a rhythm that said this was a dance they had rehearsed for generations. The sheriff's nephew learned a new respect that day. He saw a white cloth on a lance turned into a strip of damp sacks and understood finally that peace is the work that keeps your house from burning. In August, when the heat shakes itself and men shake their heads at the price of salt, the tribe moved again, a small move, the way a camp breathes. The boy came with the line to my south fence, slid down, and set something on the post. A small braid of hair wrapped with a thin blue thread and tied with a knot that resisted a man's impulse to undo things he doesn't understand. He tapped it once, then my wrist twice, then pointed to the barn and to my house and to the rosemary on the hill, where the rosemary has rooted a woman I still talk to. He opened his hand so I could see his palm and then closed it so I would know that what he had given was not mine to spend without permission. I nodded. We reached an agreement without signatures. When the tribe moved on, the barn did not empty. It learned a new job. It became a place where gifts rest until they are needed, where I stack wood I cut with patience, the way someone stacked for me, where I keep seed from plants that grew well, labeled in the clumsy script of a man who wants the next season to remember this one's good news. On the back wall, above the feed bins, I hung the wooden horse the boy had carved. When the morning sun comes through the east cracks, the horse throws a shadow that looks like a living thing moving across hay. I've caught myself nodding to it the way I nod to a neighbor on the road. You might ask what the bow was in the end. The bow in the title people who like to name stories will put on ours. It did not happen once. It happens when Mabel says a name softly and better, when the sheriff's nephew puts his rifle down without making a speech, when Boone closes his mouth long enough to hear the wind move through grass, when I lift a spoon, knowing sometimes it is worth more than a badge. Most days the bow is a small one, the kind you make with your head because your hands are busy doing what the day asks. This morning I sat on my porch, fresh paint behaving like it intends to last, and watched the windmill count time. The beadwork on my wrist warmed in the sun. The rosemary on the hill sifted her smell into the yard. In the barn, hay settled like a congregation finding its hymn. I took my hat off, not for ceremony, just to give my head a breath. In the quiet, I heard a sound from the south, the low rhythm of riders who know where they're going and aren't in a hurry to get there. I stood, not because I had to, but because standing is what you do when friendship arrives. They came along the fence, a line, small this time. The boy, older, a little heavier with the good weight of dinners that call you to the table, lifted his hand, 2 fingers, shoulder high. He smiled. I lifted mine the same. We did not need words. He pointed to the barn, touched his chest, then mine, then the earth. He said one word, his mouth opening and closing on it like a man tasting a new fruit and recognizing an old sweetness. "Enough," I answered. And what I meant was, enough to share, enough to winter, enough to learn, enough to admit we were wrong yesterday and be better by noon. The barn behind me held what it held. The house breathed. The land listened. The tribe moved on. The way a river moves past a rock it has decided is worth circling. I sat back down on my step. There is paint yet to scrape on the east wall, and I will scrape it. There is hay to stack, and I will stack it. There is gratitude to practice, a verb, not a feeling, and I will practice it dawn after dawn, with a spoon, with two hands, with the quiet that makes room for other voices to be right in your yard. When people ask, as they will, if I was the lonely rancher who fed a starving child, I'll say I was the man who filled a bowl one night and woke to a barn full of grammar the next morning. And if they laugh, I'll pour them coffee and hand them a broom and point to the corner that needs sweeping. Some lessons are better learned standing up.